branch librarian here. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon and thank our community partner, the Jamaica Plain Historical Society, for co-hosting this program. Before we get started, I just have a couple brief announcements. So first, I want to ask everyone who's joining us in person to please take a moment and make sure that you've silenced your cell phone or put it on vibrate. For folks joining us on Zoom, I want to ask that you please mute your microphone during the presentation portion of our program. There will be a Q&A immediately following our presentation, and we're going to go back and forth between taking questions from folks who are joining us on Zoom, as well as the folks who have joined us here in person. Our guest speaker is also going to be selling and signing books after his presentation. Next month, independent journalist Kim Kelly will be joining us via Zoom on Wednesday, May 11th at 7 p.m. to discuss her forthcoming book, Fight Like Hell, The Untold History of American Labor. Kim will be joined in conversation by Nick Jurovich, the assistant professor of history at UMass Boston, who some of you may remember from our labor history program last May. And to sign up for that program, just go to bpl.org and to the event page. Now, I would like to introduce our guest, Wayne Miller. Mr. Miller was a special agent, criminal investigator, and certified fire investigator for the U.S. Treasury, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms for 25 years. He has been involved in numerous high-profile criminal cases involving legal firearms, bombings, and arson. He was also a member of the ATF National Response Team, responding to major fire and explosion incidents. During his career, Mr. Miller examined more than 2,300 fire and explosion scenes, responded to over 25 major incidents, as well as testified as an expert in more than 40 cases in federal and state courts in criminal and civil cases. For the past 17 years in the private sector, Mr. Miller has been a fire and explosion analyst for Massachusetts-based Wright Group, Inc. He recently published his second book, Bang, Boom, Burn, about some of his other high-profile cases. So please join me in a warm welcome for Wayne Miller.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, folks, for coming here today. And thank you to the Jamaica Plain Historical Society and all the people who are online right now. I really appreciate it. This should be a lot of fun. There's a lot of good slides, some good information. This is a story that you may or may not remember. So many people don't, but it has kept me busy for the past 3 years, and it kept me busy for 3 years from 1982 to 1985. You can imagine when there's 264 fires in a short period of time, how busy people can be. To advance. Let's see if I come closer to you. Okay. Emily gave a pretty good introduction, so I don't need to spend much time with that. But because I was with ATF for 25 years and a week, the pay period ended that following Saturday. I did my whole career right here in Boston. I grew up in Rhode Island, I moved here in 1976, and did 25 years here. For some reason, not advancing so fast. Okay. I was with the ATF Arson Task Force, which was created in March 1982. I volunteered until my retirement in 2001. Will they see me with the slides going? No, it doesn't matter. It's just that I'm not sure this is working. I volunteered to become a certified fire investigator, and it was the first school that ATF put on. It's one of the few things the federal government has really, really done right. When they created the arson groups and the certified fire investigator, CFI program, they put good money into it. And we have approximately 90 to 100, well, forgive me for when I say that, I haven't been with ATF in 20 years now, but it's hard to get rid of the weak. For instance, we have about 90 to 100 guys in the entire country that respond to fire incidents in their home territories usually, unless you're on the national response team, which I'll talk about briefly later too. And the CFI program you have to have so much training every single year. The program started with a 2-year training. You had to go to 100 fires at least, and you had to have 240 hours of training. And every single year, you have to keep up the number of fires and training. And the training that they gave us was unbelievable. Like the federal government bought up homes in a floodplain, and we set up those homes to burn. And we would put gear on, and we'd go inside and watch it from the initial spark until it became untenable conditions. We moved out. They were videotaped. They were computerized in the sense you could measure the oxygen level, CO level, everything as it changed. And then we get to look at those fires afterwards and look at the damages. We got small appliances, coffee makers. One coffee maker we took apart and we took thermal protection out of them. That keeps it from thermal runaway, from burning in your house. Mr. Coffee's way back in the 80s didn't have those protections, and they had quite a few fires. We put a second one, identical, next to it, and we put a little gasoline newspaper and watched the two of them burn. And they burn very differently. And you can x-ray them afterwards and the differences, but not many people get to do that. But the federal government did that with us every single year. I have 3,000 hours of training now. And I've taught now approximately 100 times around the country, even in Canada. So all together, in the International Association of Arson Investigators, IAAI, they have a certified fire investigator program that you have to qualify in order to take the test. And it's quite a rigorous program. And I was a CFI with them for 35 years also. And then the right group for 17 plus years. As Emily said, 2,300 fire and explosion incidents, about 100 of those being explosions. And not many people get to see 100 explosions of all types. Anything from bombings to natural gas, to gasoline vapors in this room that could explode, to dust explosions, all types of explosions. And testifying. An attorney who worked with me on a case in St. Louis almost 20 years ago. And testifying as an expert, you have to be a little masochistic. You have to like getting whipped around the head and ears and the back, that type of thing. It's going to happen. It doesn't matter how well you prepare and how well you did your case. In fire cases, there's always something that opposing counsel can come up with question-wise. You know, once there was a document put out by the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, and that document, the attorneys can read also. It's sort of like the Bible of fire investigators today. And I read it, and I've read the new editions and the new editions. As a matter of fact, when an attorney gives me an edition, I say, oh, this is the old edition. You know, I'm trying to show that he's not up to speed sometimes, you know. But they might ask you a question out of that book. And if you don't know how to respond, you know what a gray card is when you're taking photographs with film? I forgot what the percentage was, 70% gray card. It was something that professional photographers would photograph the gray card first, so the rest of your pictures were in sync with the appropriate colors. Well, there was one line in NFPA 921, the document, and the attorney said, you read this, right? You took your own photographs, right? Yes. And did you use a 70% gray card? And the guy said, no. No idea what he was talking about. You know, but now I learned after that, when you show me the document, sometimes they don't have it, so they just go on to the next question. Sometimes they'll show you the document, I read the sentence before and sentence afterwards, and I realize my photo is a clear and accurate representation of what I saw on that date. So the gray card thing is just a, you know, red herring, you know, that type of thing. Oops. Oh, because I wrote this book, that's why I'm here. I never had social media in my life. So I have my own website. You can look that up. If you just hit Google Burn Boston Burn, you can see other presentations. You can see part of the Chronicle. You know, you all know Chronicle on Channel 5, 7:30 at night. They did the full episode on this case back in November of 20, I think it was, and then a rerun in February. So never had this at all. I have my own Facebook, but it's Burn Boston Burn, not Wayne Miller. Okay, I don't have a Wayne Miller page. And you know, the Historical Society, because they advertised this, a woman got a hold of me on through my website, which you go there and it has my email. And she said, right here, Paul Gore Street, right here. But it was a little bit earlier than when I was working fires. It ended up being 75, 76. She said she lived in a 4-story and it caught on fire. And she got rescued from the top floor. She was a young mother. And she got rescued from the top floor. And 15 people went to the hospital that day. And smoke inhalation. Nobody died. 2 firefighters, smoke inhalation, and the rest were residents. A woman jumped out the window and it's right at the corner of Lamartine Street. Okay, and I've been on these streets myself. And she found a picture on the Historical Society website of the building after it burned. And it was pretty cool. And that's what I loved about writing and the subsequent meeting of people all over the place. Old friends. I've now done this 40 times live. As far as Reno, Nevada. Last year, Wisconsin, Chicago, Indy, Myrtle Beach, all over the place. So the LinkedIn page is the same thing, Burn Boston Burn, and a Twitter page, which I don't do much on. You want the sound up? I have to do it manually. Okay. Is that better, folks? Let them know. There's the cover of the book. Keep it there for a second. It should have had quotation marks around the largest arson case in the history of the country. And the book cover was done by our son-in-law. And he did my second book cover. Also, he's a graphic designer. That photograph was actually taken by arsonist Greg Bemis. And I give him credit right on the back. Right with my son-in-law doing the design, but he gets the credit. And that was right here in Jamaica Plain, that particular fire. And I will talk about that. But the reason it should have quotation marks is because Bill Weld said that quote when he was the U.S. attorney before he became governor there. And that was when we made the arrest in July of '84. Why did I put that? Because he said that. That's why I left it there. However, today, in this day and age, 40 years later, there's a couple of cases where John Orr, I just saw it again on Forensic Files last night, arson investigator in California, well known, also the biggest arsonist in California. He, for 25 years, was probably setting fires by himself. He did wildland and buildings, and he killed 4 people. And he never confessed. And they don't really have positive information of how many fires he might have set. Mike Cabral was the prosecutor out there. I know Mike, and he said maybe he said 1,000 fires, which would be a lot more than my fires, but we don't know. Okay. And then Thomas Sweat down in Washington, D.C. got picked up by a combination of ATF and D.C., Maryland investigators. Thomas Sweat also was setting fires for about 25 years. He would do sheds, cars, and some buildings. He confessed to 350 fires, but we have 264 confirmed structure fires and well over 100 dumpsters that we didn't count, okay? And we have 9 guys in a giant conspiracy, which makes it very different. So I still call it the largest arson case in the history of the country. Very briefly, why does ATF work on fires? 1970, the Explosive Act of 1970 came in, and ATF was given a jurisdiction. And we didn't work fires initially, but if you, again, pour a certain amount of gasoline in this room with the air mixture, and you apply a ignition source, it could explode. It might not, but we would have to prove that it could have exploded, or a device was used, a bomb or something was used that made it explode. If it exploded, that was easy to work, but if it could have exploded and didn't, then we had to prove something. That was a very strange way to work on fires. And ATF didn't get involved really with fires until the late 70s, and more earnestly in the early 80s. Ronald Reagan became president. It's not the first time I'm going to mention his name today. He became president, and in 1982, we changed the federal law. If you damage or destroy a building by explosive or fire, he added 2 words only, or fire, and that jurisdiction was given to ATF. The reason was, there's a famous book put out in the 70s because these fires were happening in all the major cities in the United States. Boston was burning too. The Bronx, Chicago, LA. Cities were burning down. A lot of urban renewal, a lot of, domestic type violence, that type of thing. But these fires were happening so much that the state and local guys could not work the more complex investigations. If there's an argument between a husband and wife, and he sets fire by the front porch on the doorway to block her in the house type of thing. That's fairly easy for Boston to figure out and doesn't take a lot of time. But the more complicated cases, they didn't have the time, energy, training, money. ATF provided all that. If there's a major incident and the national response team gets involved, there's 4 teams in the country: Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, and Western teams. And we responded to any place in the country within 24 hours, and even outside the country. I went to Puerto Rico on New Year's Day in 1986, when 97 people died in the DuPont Plaza hotel fire. The fire happened on New Year's Eve, and I was on an 8 a.m. flight, New Year's Day. The only time ATF doesn't work on a fire is if you have a single family home. We don't typically work on them unless we're invited to work alongside the state or local guy. I was always in Norfolk County, and Westwood, Norwood, Canton, and Walpole, those guys invited me to every single fire so I could see more fires and learn. You have to see fires to learn. And I would give them my training. So it was a cross-training type of thing. And we worked a lot of cases together. And those guys are still my friends today. If it's a federal building, it's FBI jurisdiction. I just mentioned the DuPont Plaza in '86. That was horrible. I was there 8 days. And you remember the West Warwick fire with the people piled in the doorway trying to escape the nightclub? Well, it was very simple. The people were in the doorway of the casino trying to get out one single doorway that opened into the room. And 87 of the 97 were piled right there. The Meridian Bank building, it's like the Wall Street of Philadelphia area. It was 32 stories, and the fire started on 21 on a Saturday. And firefighters couldn't put it out. They grandfathered sprinkler system on the 30th floor. Let's have a sprinkler system on the 30th floor. And that's really what put it out. But they lost 3 firefighters in that fire. The national response team was not invited because Philadelphia wanted to work the room. But I was one of three ATF agents that was invited to that scene. And I co-authored the origin and cause report. Origin is where the fire starts, and cause is what happened. The Worcester cold storage, everybody here knows that, I'm sure. The 20th anniversary was a couple years back. There's something on the news every single year on December 3rd. I was living in Franklin at the time, and I saw it cut into the TV programming early, and I responded that night. It was a Friday evening, and we lost 6 firefighters in a horrific fire. And, 3 weeks before Christmas even makes it worse. So Boston was known for a while as the arson capital of the country. And something had to be done. And that's why Boston was chosen as one of the task force cities. There were only 4 initially, and that was New York, Chicago, LA, and Boston. I love to show this to people when I do the out of town ones, because they don't know the way around. So, we got the JFK Library down in Dorchester on the water here. Whoops, go back one. I don't want them to see that one yet. Castle Island, downtown Boston, Back Bay, Fenway Park, Franklin Park Zoo. You get down towards, you get the Mattapan down this direction right here, and you're out in the High Park. The reason I show this, and you can see just to the north is Chelsea, Somerville. My wife Joyce here, she's my biggest supporter, and she grew up in Revere, and her dad was a captain on Revere Fire, and her brother was a captain on Revere Fire, and she lived through a 3-decker fire herself. So it's interesting that we met at a singles joint. And how does that connection, fire department and her family, and living through a fire, and me being a firefighter, how does that happen? Yeah. And she never came to that place and never would have gone back. It was the first and only time she would have been at that particular location. This slide, the reason I love to show this is the first 107 fires set by this crew. Look at the concentration. Very few of those first 107 were outside the city. A couple to the north, we got Chelsea, Everett, in that area, and a couple to the south. Did we make Quincy? Can't tell anymore. But maybe down into Quincy, and Canton might have been in that one. But you can see the concentration. Blue Hill Avenue runs right through the city, right? Almost the entire city from downtown right to Canton. And you can almost see Blue Hill Avenue, and then they just go left and right off of Blue Hill Avenue. The players, Greg Bemis was the youngest. He turned 20 years old on November 4th, 1980, the same day, Proposition 2.5, I'll explain in a minute, just refresh people's minds. And the same day, Ronald Reagan was elected. So I said I was going to mention his name again. And so Greg was the youngest. He was a call firefighter out in Acton Stowe and dispatcher for the police and fire departments. And he was a fire buff. His mom used to take him to fires when he was a kid. And he had radios from the time he was like 7 or 8 years old with Boston fire calls on it. And he would listen to that. And he learned the fireboxes. Boston still have the fireboxes on corners and stuff, right? Well, back then, some of them were call boxes. You could open them up. He knew the number and the address for virtually all the fireboxes in the city of Boston. We're talking about 1,400 of them. And so Greg was a big player in this. And I'll tell you right now, Greg is a professional friend of mine today. He did prison time, and he is a big part of this book. I'll explain that too. Lenny Kendall was his best friend, call firefighter. Robert Wabluski, Boston full-time police officer, wanted to be a firefighter. Donald Stackpole once upon a time wanted to be a firefighter, but the poor guy physically was about 4x4. And he had a felony record too, a small felony. But he owned a private security agency here in Boston. And he had a trailer in Southie. And they used the trailer a lot in Southie for their meetings. Ray Norton, one of the nastiest. Stackpole was the nastiest in this whole crew. These other guys, famous today, if you talk to them, like we do, my wife gets stuck with him. He calls the house. But he's an affable person. Wroblewski never showed any anger to me whatsoever. But Stackpole and Norton was a full-time Boston firefighter. And even on the job, the guys weren't crazy about him. Joe Gorman, the biggest guy, about 6'6". He wanted to be a state trooper actually, but he was a fire buff because his dad took him to fires when he was a kid. And these fire buffs, there's nothing wrong with being a fire buff. I'm a Boston Red Sox, Celtics, Bruins, etc. fan. These guys have a different sport. They collect memorabilia. That, you know, there's a lot of old stuff out there. Arthur Fiedler was one of the biggest fire buffs in the city of Boston. And if you go to the Fire Museum on Congress Street, just down from the Children's Museum, and it's a great take, and they just reopened. And you go down there, and there's helmets that were lining the ceiling that Arthur Fiedler had collected. And he would go to fires, and these guys take pictures. They watch firefighting operations, the equipment. I'm going to a antique fire show next week. I know nothing about fire trucks. You know, one's a ladder, one's an engine. You know, I know nothing about it. But those guys love these stories, and I'm going to be selling books at their program. But fire buffs, they have the Boston Sparks Association, which is right upstairs at the museum. And they have legitimate members. A couple of these guys, Wroblewski and Gorman, were members of the Sparks Association. And then a couple other guys kept getting rejected. Wayne Sandin, a full-time police officer for Boston Housing Authority, lived right out here in Rosendale. We had a neighbor that lived right in the same building with him. When he moved to Franklin eventually, the neighbor did. And we were sitting there, he was a firefighter here in Boston. We were just talking about Wayne Sandin. Oh, he lived right downstairs. And the story's just amazing. Mark Svenby didn't join the conspiracy until '83. And then the last guy, that foolish character that he was, an old friend of Donald Stackpole's, grew up across the street from Stackpole, but then moved to Ohio. Not part of the arson group whatsoever, until Stackpole called him and said, "Hey, I'm afraid Wroblewski might talk. He's been arrested. Can you house him and get him a job out in Ohio?" And Chris said, "Yeah, I'll take care of that." And we have it on tape and everything else. So he became the 9th member of the conspiracy. What is a conspiracy, quickly, folks? I'm not going to ask you, Mr. Attorney. You have to have 2 or more people, and one of those people can't be a police officer working the job. 2 or more people have to join together and agree to commit a crime. You and I, we can go back here and burn this place, right? And you agree, that's still not a conspiracy. The next thing you need is an overt act. Let's go buy the gasoline. No, you go buy it. I'll watch. You need the overt act. You need them to do something. ATF did a bunch of reverse things. We hired people that were introduced to us through drug buys or gun buys. The Vermont State Trooper who was buying stuff from one guy and said, "Oh, do you know anybody who needs a building burned?" That's what the bad guy said. And he had burned 4 dairy barns up in the Northeast Kingdom. And we hired him to burn a building. And I was on the inside of that building when he came through the door to burn it. And that story's in the second book. Okay, there's 3 of the group right here. They happen to be in South Boston court for a different reason. That's Boston Police Officer Robert Wroblewski, Mark Svenby, Donald Stackpole. This picture was taken by Boston Fire Department, but there was a licensing issue relative to his security company. Prop 2.5, quickly, very simple. Voted in by the citizens of Massachusetts, as I said, November 1980. A tax cutting measure. If your property is valued at 100,000, you can only be taxed $2,500. That's the simple. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but that's the simple one. What happened here in Massachusetts, well, it's a state tax anyway. But what happened, we have so many older cities. Besides Boston, you got the Worcester, New Bedford, Lowell, Lawrence, Springfield, Holyoke, there's a lot of old cities and towns that the property was valued really low back then. You could have bought a brownstone in South End, an entire brownstone for $15,000 in 1970s, So when they made this law, where was the money going to come from? And what happens? The usual suspects get laid off. They did not know how they were going to pay the civil servants. It's not moving. These particular guys were really affected. They met each other at the Howard Johnson's next to Boston Fire Headquarters, in the Mass Ave, and I forget the name of the street. But right across the street was Howard Johnson's. And that would be a site that the fire bus would go to and meet and wait listen to the radios for a call. And then they'd scurry out to wherever the call was. And Bemis came all the way in from Acton Stowe. Other guys were Weymouth and Boston and various locations close by. And he met these guys, and all of them were a little older than him. And Ray Norton was a lot older than him, like 14, 15 years, almost like a father figure. Because Greg's mom died when he was 16 of cancer. And she was the one that taught him about fires. And then his dad moved to Maine with a new wife, and Greg finished high school living with Lenny Kendall, so left behind. And Greg needed a father figure. This is the first fire they set in Roxbury. And it's February 19th, 1982. 2 weeks later, the arson task force in Boston was formed. We had 8 guys and a supervisor, and we didn't know about these guys. We didn't have any idea about this crew at this point, and they didn't know about us. And we had a Boston fire lieutenant assigned with us. He was cross-designated, sworn in as a marshal, so he could be privy to grand jury material and carry a gun. And he drove one of our cars and had a desk in our office. So we worked with Boston Fire on a daily basis. You saw how big that fire was. Well, this one here is JP. This is where the high school is, in that area now. American Cellophane? Pretty close if it isn't right where the high school is. And again, that's the same fire. They hit it twice. This building was so big that both fires almost look identical. And it was a vacant building. So it's not a ongoing business. Serial arson cases. These were serial arsons. I called them domestic terrorists back in the early 1980s, before the term became popular. Now you hear it. I heard it just this morning on the news. And a twisted version of Robin Hood. Instead of stealing from the rich to give to the poor, when Prop 2.5 went into effect, Boston lost 600 firefighter positions in 2 years. 400 through rapid attrition and 200 through direct layoff. 22 fire companies. I know there's a couple right here at South Huntington and on Center Street. And if every other one gets closed down, 22 fire companies shut. Nobody working there. Closed, painted on the doors, that type of thing. These guys were smart. They knew fires in the city of Boston. They knew where the alarm boxes are. So if you're in down Paul Gore and you set a fire, but you steal the firebox that's on that street, which they did. You steal the firebox and somebody's driving there at 2 a.m. in the morning, how are you going to notify somebody? Most people don't knock on somebody's door around here in the middle of the night. Any of these neighborhoods, whether it's Roxbury, Dorchester, JP, Charlestown, Southie, all of the residential neighborhoods, they were hitting preferred buildings, and I'll explain that in a second. They made patterns, profile patterns. Temporal means time of day. All the fires were after midnight and before 5 a.m. Geography, that's where the type of building comes in too, as well as neighborhoods first. They said, we're going to hit 3 family homes, 3-deckers. And we're famous for those, aren't we? You don't get those in the New York area like this. You don't get them in other parts of the country. But here we have so many of them. And in my book, I call them 3-deckers and triple-deckers until one of my Norwood firefighter friends said, a triple-decker is a sandwich wing. Don't use that term anymore. Stick with the 3-deckers. What else do we have on our 3-deckers around here? A lot of them were built in the 1940s with siding. What kind of siding do we have? That asphalt, just like the shingles on roofs, asphalt siding, which is nothing but solid gasoline. So we call them gas shingles for a nickname, and they go right down to ground level. You could take a nice lighter against one of those and get it going, and it'll get up to that roof line in a matter of minutes. So when those fires started happening, but these guys knew the city and their law enforcement and their fire guys, so we didn't have any suspects. And these fires ramped up February, March, April, May, June. June had about 40 fires. June 10th, the busiest night in Boston Fire Department history. These guys set 4 multiple line fires, altogether around 10 fires that night. June 25th, second daughter was born. Torn with my first wife. I'm sorry, Joyce wasn't my first wife. She wasn't my second choice, but it was many years after. We've been married already 26 years, but my second daughter was born. And you can see I have a 1-year-old daughter at that time. And you're torn between the hospital and the kids and everything else, and the 10 fires that came in on June 25th, 1982. And so we couldn't follow anybody at this point. We tried to set up in Southie because Southie ended up, if you get multiple fires, if you get fires that fit a pattern, they became known as the Friday night firebug, but it was actually early Friday morning. And Mr. Flare. Nobody knows where the term Mr. Flare came from. Greg took that as his nickname. Greg attended 260 of the 264 structure fires they set. He's the only one any place near that. The rest of the people were 50 to 100. So you start getting multiple fires. Now, we started realizing later on in the spring that something was going on. But we'd have a list of 18 people and reduce it down to 16 and then back up to 18. These guys weren't really on the list yet. The patterns from these fires, so many of them were like that first one you saw, or the second one you saw. But the patterns, a lot of them were set on the outside. They had a little simple device. It had some fuel to it. It had a matchbook and cigarette or time delay device. And they placed that device right next to the outside, but they went inside a ton. These places were open, wide open, a lot of them torn apart. We have a lot of plaster and lath walls here. If you take the plaster off, it's nothing but these little, like fairing strips in a sense, that make great kindling. And a lot of trash are in these buildings, that type of thing. So a lot of them were set in places that had no electricity, no heat, no cooking, no, nothing. And we didn't have as many homeless people living in some of these homes or anything. So it'd be pretty rare that a cigarette or something like that caused it. And you could tell if there was a campfire and stuff, like people with cans left over and stuff, like in the Worcester warehouse, we could tell the two homeless people had lived in the office in that building. If it wasn't for Boston Fire and their origin and cause reports, each one of the fires has a report, and the job isn't done until the report's done. And it has an address, and it has the area that they believe a fire started at. That's the origin. Whether it's the basement, whether it's a front porch, or it's a back loading dock to a commercial old loading dock. And even if they didn't know exactly what caused the fire, they said that somebody intentionally set it because we didn't have any other elements there with ignition sources. Now today, we're supposed to actually name what the ignition source is. We say most likely open flame. And they use this device that we couldn't find. It's in a paper bag, a brown paper bag. And they're walking down the street with this little device, and there's some liquid fuel in a baggie. And they'll set the device down. And when it burns probably 90% of it. Then you add fire hoses and you add fire damage. And we never found these devices until much later on when something else was added. Some of this is for training material. Confessions can't stand alone. We get confessions on these cases eventually. It doesn't matter if I confess to you, which I'm going to do right now. I personally set 100 fires. Now, what are you going to do about it? You need corroboration. You need some evidence. And they were all training fires, folks. This one here, oh God, I can't remember the streets anymore. It's a Dorchester fire. I love the way it looks, though. It's a weird thing that you're a fire investigator or a firefighter, and it was a good fire or a crappy fire or something like that. But this is an amazing fire. 3 floors, fully involved. This particular one was set down in the basement. This particular fire, and that's the same building. And that, what does that firefighter have? He has an empty hose line. It's not charged yet. So he'll be lucky to save the exposure to the right-hand side of that screen. That glare that you see is the next building. There is problems with these fires now. We're working, we meet with Boston, and eventually we meet with the state fire marshal, who doesn't work in Boston typically. Boston handles their own, and so doesn't Worcester, and so doesn't Springfield. The major cities usually handle their own situations. So initially, we're meeting with Boston regularly. The supervisors meet, the head of the fire investigation unit, and the investigators meet. We have Stevie McLaughlin right in our office. And at each fire, the problem is each one is a separate incident. Even if you can start connecting them, you still have to interview if there's an owner. If it's the city of Boston owned quite a few of these, those two, because they just were left. But you have to find an owner, occupants to interview. If there's businesses, you have banks and competitors, and the first person respond who discovered it could be a cabbie, a homeless person, insurance companies. You get a lot of work to do on each incident, and that's what takes time. And that's why this case kept going and going. Besides, you could have 600 potential suspects just in the fires. Firefighters were laid off, and we hated to say that the union could have been involved, but nobody wanted to believe that. But would you, in a sense, nobody likes a slap on the face in public like that either. But in a sense, some of these guys felt like they were given the right to go out and burn a building. You know, when these arson suspects, they eat dinner at the firehouses. They have so many friends on the fire department. They go to the Sparks Club picnic every summer. We're going again in a couple months. But these guys would go to the picnic and talk to firefighters. What a strange time. The firefighter would say, yeah, somebody's out there doing this. on payday, we ought to collect some money from him. He must be going through 55 gallons of gas, that type of thing. Because firefighters don't like to sit in the firehouse. And they know that they were pawns in this layoff. And, it was a weird time in Boston. Nobody wants to see people hurt. 200 firefighters got hurt in this spree. 200. Try to identify the motive on this. Well, we kind of figured it might have something to do with Prop 2.5, but it could be a lot of things. One poor guy owned a building on 16 from Revere into Everett or something. And in 82, that burned. And in 83, a building on the Hyde Park Dedham line, that burned. Both of them owned by the same guy. I was with the state trooper who interviewed that guy. And it's described in the book, but he was being verbally crucified by the trooper, that he must have been involved. And he wasn't. Both of them were set by this crew. And they didn't know it was owned by the same person. It just happened to fit the type of building they wanted to burn. Why is this case so unique? Why could this case not happen today? Yeah, they were smart because the law enforcement knew how to get around and stuff, and they drove mock cruisers, Nerf cruisers, we call them Nerf, like a Nerf ball. They weren't real cruisers. They were the black LTDs and Impalas. And they had a whip antenna and the black walls. And they looked just like an unmarked police cruiser. And so they could get out in the middle of Roxbury in the middle of the night. And if someone saw them, they'd say, oh, a couple cops are here. Who else would be walking around in the middle of the night in some of these neighborhoods? So they thought they could get away with anything. And what's the difference today? You have a camera on every corner, don't you? Somebody's doorbell. My third book is I'm planning fiction. I'm jumping to fiction. And I'm trying to figure out how to get around these doorbells and everything else. Because it's a serial arsonist murderer. Okay. You have cameras every place. You have GPS, whether it's on a vehicle, or you can track phones. You could follow these guys if you had them as a suspect that way. Back then, once we finally got them as suspects, I had to follow one of these guys in the middle of the night in a neighborhood in Jamaica Plain. Not easy to do. And a tail would be spotted pretty quickly, wouldn't it? And you couldn't use an airplane here at night in the city of Boston. It would be hard to do. We had planes back then, and we had little things you could put underneath the car. Transmitter. Wasn't the best. They didn't work very far. But you had to have a warrant for it and all that stuff. And let me tell you, this case just kept going on and on. Boston's running around doing origin and cause investigations. ATF's working with them. We're trying to interview people, that type of thing. Okay, June 3rd, 1982. I'd like to go to this a little. I want to go to video. I can talk while video's on. So they were ramping up what they were doing. They started actually with dumpsters in the back bay. If you're driving along Stowe Drive and you look at the Boston side of the river, behind them is all these dumpsters. And they would take a simple little cigarette and matchbook and throw it in dumpster after dumpster after dumpster. And they would laugh at the city of Boston because they only had one firehouse open that would cover the back bay. And so other companies were coming from outside the back bay, and they didn't know where they were. They didn't know where they were going. Once they got to a fire, they didn't know what address they were at. The dumpsters didn't get the type of, they wanted the press. They wanted the people to yell, scream, get the mayor. Who was mayor back then? Kevin White. They wanted Kevin White to understand, you can't use this as ponds. They held a firehouse hostage in Hyde Park. They held another one in East Boston because East Boston only had 2 firehouses, and that's where the fire was that Joyce lived through. And when you get that wind off the water, they lost 3 3-deckers in one fire. And if you close one firehouse, the other one has to come from downtown through the old tunnel. You know, so you can see why people would scream. So what they did, they weren't getting enough out of it. So they jumped from some of the 3-deckers they were doing to do commercial structures. Still, none of the buildings were occupied when the fire occurred. But that's fine. You can start there. It doesn't have to go all the way to the beginning. No, that's fine. This is Sparrow Toy Company on East D Street in Southie. 1,000 foot long by 300 feet warehouse. This fire could be seen for miles. They set it on the railroad track behind the building, and it went up. It was the only place that was combustible on the whole structure. Everything else was brick, but there was tar paper. So almost the same exact type of thing you had for shingles. And they set the fire there, and it went up to the roof line where there happened to be one of those big industrial fans for a warehouse, and it went inside. And it took them 24 hours to put this out. That's fine. It's good. It's just good visuals for people. This type of fire that Boston was facing. Go back to a large residential one. But Sparrow Toy was a business that imported cheap Chinese toys, stuffed toys, plastic, all in boxes and all on pallets. Imagine once that fire got inside, how much fuel there was. And that's a company that affects interstate commerce because they sell the toys all over the United States. And that's how the feds get involved. It has to be a commercial bill. I did residents with local guys, but we have to do commercial structures because it affects interstate commerce. You want to know how simple it is to affect interstate commerce? Any restaurant you go in, if they have Heinz ketchup on the table, that's a real simple version. Heinz ketchup comes from Pittsburgh, and if you burn that restaurant, it can no longer buy and you can no longer use the Heinz ketchup there. Okay? So it's as simple as that. It's a little more complicated. There's a lot more to it, but just to explain it. This particular fire, you can see it's daytime now, but when this fire, you can see it's raging also. Nat Whittemore is my biggest supporter after Joyce, and he's a member of the Boston Sparks Association, and for 40 years he was a WBZ news cameraman. All the video here is Nat Whittemore's. All the photos you see are Bill Noonan, who was a Boston Fire Department photographer for 35 plus years. This particular fire was not set by the crew. We kept it in here. Nat initially thought it was. You can see it was set up on maybe the fire was started on the 3rd or 4th floor, and it started collapsing above that. The reason we kept this is because this was on a night where the guys had already set 4 other fires. Now, with Boston being so spread out and with the diminished numbers on each engine and each ladder that can get, look at that thing raging from about the 3rd or 4th floor right up through the roof. That these guys are tired. They're beaten, they're worn. They're responding to fire after fire after fire. Again, they're doing 30 to 40 in a month. A lot of nights they would do 2 or 3, but they would do more some other nights. In this particular one, and you'll watch in a second here, they're all running towards it because it just collapsed, partial collapse. And Nat Whittemore told me that he's not retreating, he's relocating. Okay, you don't want to say you're retreating from a fire. So this is the type of fires that Boston was facing now. This was right next, this was on Washington Street. Could you see the elevated train back then? And they had to close that line down for a few days. So, well, again, we're not getting anywhere. The feds aren't helping much. I mean, we're just running around like chickens with our heads cut off. We're trying to do our best, and we're not coming up with anything. You can just let that. I better cut it. While you got it there, while you have it there, oh, I was going to say let's push it near the end because I want them to see the end file later. I'm almost out of time already. How did we resolve this case? Slide it right to the. That's about good right there. They can see that. Nat Whittemore's out there with Ed Fowler from the Cambridge Fire Department. Ed's another fire buff. He's passed away now, and he was a famous photographer. That's fine. You can keep that right there. This is Garrity Lumberyard 2. Garrity Lumberyard 1, same location, happened a month earlier. And that fire looked like this. Now look at this. Robert Gabluski, can you just touch that back just a second? Boston police officer off duty. They're sitting on a lumber pile. Nat Whittemore is photographing. He took his gun out and he waved it in the air for about 2.5 seconds and put it back. Now, Gorman was over there. Stackpole was in the middle. Bemis was on the right. And they were looking to the right because Ray Norton from Boston Fire was sitting on a different pile, didn't get caught by the camera. That was our first big break. That wasn't until November 21, 1982. And good, thank you. That's good. It gives you a nice view of what happened. That was not shown, and you can put the slides back on, please. Thank you, Greg. That was not shown on TV. BZ called us and Boston Police and Fire, and we met with them at BZ Studio, and we saw the raw footage. And a couple guys could identify who Gabluski was, and maybe one other. We didn't know everybody in this crew. Nat Whittemore and Ed Fowler knew some of these guys, and they'd see them at fires, and they yell, and they cheer, and they're loud, and it's really strange. And they rooted for the home team. Who's the home team? A fire. They were rooting for the home team. And that's good. Excellent. Thank you. I'll just keep pushing those along. This is exploratory. That's the very first time that the National Response Team came to Boston. You have to be invited, whether we put the offer out there and then the invitation comes, but we have to be invited. If it wasn't for state and local people, ATF wouldn't exist. I just wanted to show you just from the indictments. This was the first indictment. We only had partial information. Look at the dates up there. Now we're in June. Whole June from that. June 11th, when all the fires were. Now, we don't have all of them because this is only partial information from a witness. June 25th, my second daughter was born. And they're all grouped. You can see where a lot of these fires are. Easy access. You can skip right over that too. This is the south end. Amazing 100-year-old church. Look at that picture taken by Bill Newman. That had to be what? 30 feet across that stained glass window. That's what it looked like the next day. This is January 1983. Now, let me stop right here for a second and just tell you, Gabluski was identified November 21 as being out there with these guys. We knocked, my partner and I, Bill Murphy, knocked on his door in Weymouth a couple days after. We got in his, he let us in the apartment. He didn't seem nervous. We sat down and we said, you know, law enforcement to law enforcement. you know anything that can help us? I'm a fire buff. I just hang with these guys. Nothing really. But on the floor, right there in the living room, was a firebox. Bill Murphy puts his trench coat on that he wore like every day. And oh, my granddaughter makes plants out of these. I just wanted to see the 4-digit number in front. Blame you. You don't need a warrant to do that. Box 1712, the first one missing in Boston that year. Boston typically has 1, possibly 2 missing every year. 14 of them were gone that year. They were taken partially as collector's items, but because of what I explained to you, if there's a fire at the corner of A and B streets and there's a firebox nearby, and the firehouse used to be at C Street, but now it's on E Street, and you delayed the response, you delayed the communication if there is a fire, and then you delay because the firehouse is much further. They knew what they were doing, and that's why they did that. So we interviewed Bruce. He lied right to our faces. He came in with an attorney, took polygraph, and flunked it bad. I don't know what game he was playing with, trying to play. Flunked it. His attorney told me, face to face in the office, he can't talk. Okay. I don't know what that means. You know, we can help if it's a problem with somebody's threatening or he's going to lose his job or whatever. But he can't talk. We didn't talk to him again. That was the first week of December, 1982. We didn't talk to him again until January 1984. 13 months. Boston police had an internal affairs thing. They took him off the streets. No longer had his gun. He was up in the turret, which is the dispatch area, Boston PD. And that's where he worked for the next 13 months. That fire, is what we started to do in January was knocking on other doors. And eventually I came up with Wayne Sandin, another police officer, as a source of information. He couldn't be an informant. Police officers can't be informants for a federal government like that, but they can be sources of information. Wayne Sandin became a source, and that just came about because of that video. And we identified some of the crew. This fire is infamous to certain people in Boston because it's the Boston Sparks Association upstairs here with their memorabilia, stuff like that. This is the Ola Brothers Mechanicals. They were heating and plumbing type guys. This was in Southie. They planned this fire really well. I just put that just to give you a quick. This is the number of alarms. This is on June 11th. Brookside Ave. That's this big fire right here. You did that? 6 alarms, 3 alarms, 5 alarms, plus 4, 5, 6 other fires that same night. Yeah, there it is. And that's, again, that's what's on the cover. See that chief all by himself? Now you got a ladder getting up behind him, but there's still no water. I thought the chief was having a cigarette right there. He's actually on a radio. But he's shrugging his shoulders. The reason we put Norwood apparatus in that particular picture, that was June 11th, because Norwood was the first to respond to a fire in Boston for that particular fire, because everybody else was tied up. And that's what, 15 miles? What could we have done differently? I don't know, be more aggressive maybe. But Wayne Sandin started giving me information. Look at these clowns. That's Stackpole driving, his own personal fire truck, South Shore Fire Department, he called it, and Robert Dablewski right behind the cab. This is the beginning of the end, is Garrity 2 again. Look at the size of that fire. October 2nd, 1982, 22 firefighters fell through the roof. And seriously hurt. Broken backs, broken legs, burns, and it was horrific. These guys met the next day and said, we never intend to hurt anybody. We tried to do it in unoccupied places. They were calling in bomb scares to get the bomb squad away from that building so they could set the fire. They called in fire departments and said, you heard of the Boston firebug? He's in town. They were calling fire departments. Guys are crazy. But Sandin started giving me information in '83, August '83. He never told me directly that they set buildings on fire. They set a stolen car that was stripped at Southie on fire. They set a stolen car that caught onto a building. Stackpole might burn his patrol cars that are so many miles on them, sell them to the insurance company, you know. Fires were slowing down because they knew we were onto the group somewhat. But Wayne Sandin wasn't telling me the whole truth. He did tell me that they stole a brand new unmarked cruiser from Natick Ford and dumped it into the Fort Point Channel. He told me in August of '83, and we recovered that car. This happens to be Bemis's car later on. I don't have a picture of the original one that we recovered. But the parts were missing, and they were on Grabowski's car. Okay, and that is the car eventually. When it was impounded, somebody burned it. We have no idea, ever, who burned that car. Here's one of the fireboxes. And Greg Bemis himself burned the State Fire Academy in Stowe by himself. It was an old rickety wooden building back then. It's a beautiful building now. And he takes credit for it still today. I don't know when you would have gotten a fire academy if it wasn't for me. But they stole these air packs. Before he did it by himself. He stole these because it's a waste to burn them up in a building. This was unique. This is a threat letter, basically. I'm going to read it to you because it's hard to see all of it. I'm Mr. Flair. You know me as the Friday Firebug. They love the press putting this out. They love that. I will continue till all deactivated police and fire equipment is brought back. At the bottom it says, if occupied buildings are torn down, no, abandoned buildings, that's what that occupied buildings will be targeted next. That is a threat. And that was another count. And this one, you can see it still has a sticker for a court exhibit. And they fingerprinted it in Boston and put it in a file drawer when they came up with nothing usable. And ATF wasn't even aware of it. We learned after January 12th. We finally went back to Robert Grabowski with the stolen parts. And we're at we're at the headquarters, the old headquarters. What's that? Was it Clarendon? Berkeley, yeah. And it's going to make a great scene in the movie that I'm hoping to get done. Okay. And I'm not going to tell you every part of it, but there's 6 people in the room. Deputy Superintendent Jack Gifford, 2 Boston detectives. Robert Grabowski, Jimmy Carroll Lee, senior agent. He was about 50. I was only 30 at the time. And Jimmy was doing the talk. And Jimmy is walking back and forth with his 3-piece suit on. And Jimmy is passed away, but he was a thespian. He had his actor's card. He did plays on the North Shore. Okay. And Jimmy played his part. I thought I saw him on the stage at the Academy Awards back then. But Jimmy played his part, and he said all the right things. And Grabowski confessed that night. And I'm not going to tell you how it went down. You got to read it or watch the movie someday. Yes, I do have an agent now, and things are in the works. We'll see. So the game plan did work well. He confessed by about midnight that night. He was up working in the turret. We had him just come down to the office. We played the whole thing out. And we started working like feverishly, more feverishly, easy for me to say. But we had to prove everything that Grabowski told us about. In a short period of time that night, he told us about at least 29 fires they set. My head's spinning, my stomach is like, I'm getting upset, you know. In the middle of the night, we brought him back over to the ATF office instead of Boston PD, who didn't really want us there, except for the guys who were working with in that office that night. In the middle of the night, we called the U.S. attorney so we could cross the T's, dot the I's. And the USA came out, second in charge. Robert Mueller. You know, famous or infamous today in your point of view, but Robert Mueller was the second assistant under Bill Weld. And he told the group that night that we had to place him under arrest. We could not let him go for fear of what he might say, do to himself, etc. So we arrested him at approximately, let's see, 3:24 or 3:26 a.m. on Friday the 13th. And I had the luxury of putting the handcuffs on him and taking him for lodging that night, etc. But he had an attorney the next day. Again, he couldn't talk again for 5 months. When he did finally come over, he hired a new attorney, and I'll mention her name because she's pretty famous around here. Ricky Kleeman. Bill Bragg, you know? Yes, that was his attorney. She said, Bobby, you've got to give it up. They have you. So Bobby did, and he cooperated. He wore a wire 17 times for us, wearing the wires, undercover work, and we had a transmitter and recorder on it. And half of those were phone calls. We recorded the phone calls, and the other half were in-person meetings. And they're dramatic too. They're gonna make great film, you know, type of thing. But it worked. There was so much conversation, except for two guys. Those two guys, Stackpole and Norton, were smart enough not to say anything that would implicate them. When we did make the arrests of all the rest of them on June 25th, 1984, they were housed together, three of them. Bemis, Stackpole, and Sandin were housed together for 3 weeks in the same cell. I never heard of anything like that. Up in Salem jail, which is 110 years old at the time. And it was a pit, and it was hot. It was all heck in the middle of the summer. And Stackpole said, I have some people who can take Zabluski out and take a couple other people out. And Bemis had enough. So Bemis rolled over. There's some people you might recognize. Flynn and Dukakis and help me again. Geraldine Corral. Yep. And the dominoes just started tumbling, and we had the transcripts, and so much work had to go. We had a dozen people working 12 hours a day, putting this case together. And the arrests were made in July. Norton went, Stackpole went trial in November. That's how fast you go in the federal system. And it was nearly a 3-week trial, and he got convicted. And we only charged him with 17, 18 counts. Did that for a good reason. We had the most evidence and not to bore or confuse the jury. So we cut it down. But he got a 40-year sentence out of it. And he did 23. Under the federal system, you could have gotten out on 10 in that time period. And so he got out after that, and he's permanently housed in the Braintree Cemetery now. He died fairly young. And Bemis signed an agreement on a napkin. And it was on a weekend. The U.S. attorney went from a party to, it was on a napkin. And for 30 years, and he cooperated, testified it brilliantly in 2 trials. His memory was phenomenal, and he never got shaken by the defense attorneys. And he did great, and it got reduced. He did a little over 10 years. These guys, technically, when you hurt firefighters or any people, period, it doubles each count from 10 to 20. Could have been in there for 2,400 years, you know, that type of thing. Robert Zabluski was the first one in the door. He got a 12-year sentence, and he got out just after 10. Um, Norton never set a fire, but he was part of the conspiracy. They used his house in West Roxbury. He said, burn the, that's the way, it's one of those stone crushing plants right across the street from his house, West Roxbury. And he said, burn that conveyor belt and stuff. I can't stand that place. And he knew where they were going to be, and he was part of everything. So, but he got a 4 to 6 years. It's the Chris Damon, the kid who was out in Ohio. He went to prison for a couple, just for that small part. Let's see, Sandin got 20. Sandin. He stood in front of the judge. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to allocate. You're supposed to tell the judge your part. He never did. But his right as well. Sandin was part of 50 fires that he helped personally accept. He never told me that before, after, during. And he's given us information like that car. One for that car, he might not have made this game. You know? So Sandin, I don't know what his game ever was. So he got 26 years. And he works for the city of Boston today. In EMS, but in supply. But he works for EMS. The city he hoped to burn down. You know? I don't know. Let's see. Gorman got like a 4 to 6. The rest of them moved. Lenny Kendall was in the Air Force. He was present for that first fire I showed in Roxbury. Did not set the fire. Stayed in the car. And one other fire. And then he went in the Air Force the next day. He went to boot camp in the Air Force. And he became a firefighter in the Air Force. And he was in England. We brought him back to Georgia and then to Boston. And he's the only one that got probation and kicked out of the Air Force. So that hurt him that way. Patience, persistence, professionalism. Training helps a lot. Nothing could happen like this today. Somebody convicted arsonists still live around here. Greg Bemis does under another name, and so doesn't Robert Gabrowski. Fire cases in Boston have gone down, just like around the country, dramatically they've gone down. The arson program in Boston with ATF is no longer a group. They have 1 or 2 guys that work fires, and that's it. The state has done a great job of improving the training for their guys. This is at the very end of Chronicle. And let me read aloud and interject. My face is off to the side. How can I get my face off there? I can't read. Oh, there we go. Right there. I personally felt bad about the increase. Now, okay. You guys ever apologize to anybody? It's never a good idea to say, but you made me do this. But until the E Street military barracks, that's the one that most of the injuries were minor in nature. Do we have any firefighters retired in this room? No. But for you in the audience, you firefighters, think about it. Some sheetrock ceiling fell on top of you and knocked you down. You got a minor injury. How close were you to a major injury or death? So don't justify by saying a minor. Most of the injuries were minor in nature, and the members of the group of us foolishly rationalized that the good overrode the bad. In retrospect, that was my greatest regret. I want to interject. But I truly believe to this day, and this is 2 years ago, that the cutbacks would have been much worse in the passage of the trade bill, which was signed by Governor King at that point, to give money back to the cities and towns to rehire people. Would not have happened had it not been for our regrettable action some 35 years ago. I'm sure in almost all my audiences, when I read them, there is a vast variety of thoughts and feelings toward Greg Bemis. Some cases you cannot prosecute without having the insiders being part of your case. You do live with the devil. And if it wasn't for him and Robert Gabrowski, we may not have succeeded at trial. But yet, he probably should have been in jail for the rest of his life. I just want to mention this book for 1 minute, seeing how I'm way over time. Bang, Boom, Burn. My second book came out last fall, and very different from the first one. The first one is a long story. If you get in the middle of it, and this is the one gripe that some real readers in the world have, you get in the middle, is fire after fire after fire, and it sounds like Groundhog Day, because that's what we lived through, and that's what they were doing. But once you get beyond that, the investigation picks up. So I just wanted to, I tried to cut some down. There's not 264 fires in there, but there's 140 in that book. But the second book is 21 short stories. And for those of us who just learned how to use QR codes, there's actually another story in there. There's a QR code at the beginning and the end. It's the same one. That's a story that you can read. There's a handful of gun stories in the beginning. I did have a 46 machine gun case here in Massachusetts. Gun stolen out of Danvers Armory in '76 that we recovered in 1980 in a house in Walpole. And that's a good story. And some of the undercover stuff is good stories. The night that somebody accidentally shot a detective friend of myself when we were surveilling his house. He was just test firing a gun, but we didn't quite know that. But he shot right in our direction. Then two horrific bombing cases. The people who've been around Boston long enough, Jeremiah Hurley case in Rosenville, Boston firefighter, and he got killed, and Frank Foley was named. I wasn't the case agent, but I did work every one of these 21 cases. And then we have another one out in Western New York, amazing 50-year-old guy dating a woman about 30. She's American Indian, and her family hated him. Tried to break him up. So he got another guy to join with him. How do you get people to join conspiracies like this? I'm not sure. And sent 6 Christmas presents to her family members. 4 of them went off, killing 5. And I had one of the scenes. And then a few more arson cases at the end. Arson for profit, doctors, setting, I want to say setting. We accused him of setting a fire in Dover. 2 husband and wife school teachers, not from Westwood, but set a Westwood investment property on fire. We got them on the property, but they got juries are very different. I'm not going to tell you everything. Serial arson cases again, individual ones. Garden Country, everybody ever hear the Garden Country serial arsons? James Dix, down the South Shore, set about 25, 26 fires. Late 80s to the early 90s. So there's a bunch of short stories. And God bless America. Thank you all for your time. Anybody else who would like to get a book can get it through Amazon if you wish. You get only black and white pictures in the Amazon book. You can get them at some Barnes and Nobles. You can ask if it's not there, but you'll only get black and white pictures. The ones that you have color pictures as well as black and white, because some are only taken in black and white. And if you get it from me or my website, burnbostonburn.com, I will sign them and I individually mail them to you. So thank you. And we've been fortunate enough in the last 2.5 years to give over $7,000 to fire victim charities. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'll repeat it anyway.
So in a couple of the fires, you mentioned that there was a shortage of water in the fires.
I don't know if I did mention that, a shortage of manpower. Oh, that just because, again, you saw how blazing that fire was, how roaring it was. The manpower weren't there yet, and that was just setting up. Yes.
Okay,
Okay, he did ask about shortage of water. Most of the time, in the wintertime, you know, there's lots of problems with freezing up and stuff. But no, with manpower, basically, that caused the hose lines to be empty. Because you need people to operate the engines and have the water flow and everything else too. Okay, anybody else here? Sure.
So when you think about arson, often think about insurance money. Is there no economic motive at all for this stuff?
Except for the fact, if you think
Jobs.
they might get on the job themselves. Again, in the early 1980s, it was starting to get harder and harder for white males. You really have to do super on the test and everything else. And that played a little effect. There is a little racial tension that you can see
So
sometimes.
nobody was collecting insurance money.
None.
Owners.
Stackpole was the closest, maybe trying to get more security jobs out of it. That would be the only other profit motive that we had. Anybody else here?
I just have, I had a house fire. Not something that you don't have an accident. And the tenants told the owner that their insurance started it. All. And they had customer their insurance. So we know you didn't start it. I said, oh, God. I had been grocery shopping and the refrigerator was full. We saw, we see people who set fires to their homes still.
Wouldn't do that.
Grocery shopping. And it was the tenants, so very close to the wall. She left it on, she told me that, and she told the police that the half of the insurance. So, but, no, we had to cut it down.
Well, I've had dogs do it.
Yeah, dog. Cat. And I stupidly gave him back for 30
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah,
The food.
this woman here in the audience was falsely accused by her tenants that she might have set fire to her property. So it is something you don't want to live through if you didn't do it. Emily, you got something? What was the book you mentioned that changed the ATF law in 1982 under wreak? Not a book in a sense. Just I mentioned it's in Burn Boston Burn in that book. It's mentioned. Ronald Reagan, when he changed that law, it just goes through the Congress just like any other law, and it was put forward because it was too difficult to work on arson cases the way it was.
Jacqueline X.
A male crime.
Male crime. Not major crime. It's a major crime.
Is arson considered basically a male crime? It really is percentage-wise. I would say 80% anyway. But in the second book, there is a case in Vermont that a woman had 2 fires where she left 2 identical apartments about 2.5 years apart. And within 2 to 3 minutes, each one of them suffered the same exact fire. The first one killed her 5-month-old, and the second one killed her husband. And we did try her unsuccessfully. However, I tell you in the book that maybe if I had known more and had a different attorney, the 2 of us could have put something better together on the case. I saw one. Did you consult with the author of the Parker book, Slow Burn? No, and I read it, and I understand. It sounds familiar in a lot of ways. And some people even asked about backdraft. Backdraft is similar in a lot of ways to firefighters being involved in setting the fires. But no, we have not. The female attorney was Ricky Kleeman, R-I-K-K-I, Kleemann, I think it is, Vicky Kleemann. And she's still on, like, on TV regularly with NBC or CBS. I want to mention the white flight. That's the QR code story is related to white flight. How Boston was changing in the late 70s, and somewhat what these guys are doing also. And do you think fire safety information in school might help to stop arsonists from committing arson later in life? And do you think covering arson in fire safety programs? I think any training that the kids get from the fire department relative to fires is extremely helpful and will scare quite a few young kids that they'll never think about playing with fire. Too many kids play with fire. I never did. I wasn't a firefighter. I was a criminal investigator. I had no interest in fire stuff until on ATF about 4 years. And but yes, I think anything will help. And you know, with the COVID, with all our young kids, as well as everybody else who's had to suffer through it. But the young kids suffering so many different ways, and emotional and stuff like that. There could be more arsonists in 10, 15, 20 years. Hopefully not. And things get addressed more and more every year. Okay, folks, I appreciate everything. I love being here. I love being in libraries. And I'm glad you people came out, and folks online. I understand it was a pretty big crowd, so thank you all.